So we will have a recording for all 3 sessions. So I know that at least a few people have asked that they can follow that up. Well, let me begin with prayer and then just have everybody introduce themselves again so that we can call each other by name. By now, most of you will know each other, but let's pray. God, remind us. Remind us that you go ever before us. As the psalmist says, you have hemmed us in behind and before. You go before us, preparing the way. You come after us, cleaning up our messes. Use the time that we have that we may serve you in your name. Amen. So let's go ahead and just introduce yourselves and say which group you're in. And I know of no good way to do that. And so, Maureen, why don't you just start and we'll just let everybody jump in as they see fit.
Hi. I just jumped on. I was listening to there's a big Episcopal conference called Forma. It's one of the biggest in the country. It's right now. And I just left a really excellent meeting. So this better be really good, Scott.
No pressure.
No pressure. Actually, I really liked the last couple of chapters a lot. I am with Baptized for Life, but Lisa and Kim are both at that conference. So, and actually Lisa's a presenter. So she really can't leave there. So, but, and I work with 4 congregations, 3 in Michigan, 1 in Richland, Washington. And that's who I am. I'm just a worker bee. I'm not in charge of things. Oh, I invite someone. I know Jesse. Hi, Jesse.
Hi, Maureen. Good to see you again. I'm Jesse Bazan with the Collegeville Institute. How about Kelly?
Kelly Adams, Life is Calling at Stanford University. Nathan, I'll call on you.
Right, I'm Nathan Hayes with the Soundings Project at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. And how about Jane Patterson?
Sure. Yeah.
You're on.
Oh, great. Jane Patterson. I'm the Associate Project Director for the coordination of the Call to Lives of Meaning and Purpose Initiative and Project Director for Communities of Calling initiative that's part of Collegeville Institute. Jane, Anga.
I'm Jane Anga, and I am with Vibrant Faith with their Thriving Congregations Lily Project, and also the Director of Ministry Blueprints. And I am in Fort Myers, Florida.
And who would you like to go next?
Let's have Jesse.
I assume that's me since the other Jesse went. I'm Jesse Duisberg, and I work with Scott at Fuller, and I'm from Michigan. So Maureen, thanks for your work with Michigan churches.
I think that leaves Carrie and who else?
Oh, sorry, I forgot. Yeah, Carrie.
Sure, I'm Carrie Burns with Center for Congregational Resources at Stanford University. And I'll let Michael, my colleague, go next.
I'm Michael Wilson. The Wilson means I'm last. I work at Stanford University with the Life is Calling program, among other things, at the Center for Congregational Resources.
That's great. I think everybody's had a chance to introduce themselves. I'm Scott Cormode. I'm at Fuller, and you were stuck with my book, so you probably have learned way too much about me. What I want to do today is we promised that we would look at the last 4 chapters, and the theme we were going to look at is what kind of a culture can you build in congregations or seminaries to promote innovation. We looked last week at the process that you would use, but this week we're going to look at the culture. And so I would invite you, if you would like to turn in your hymnals, to page 152. I don't have the, if you're using Kindle, I don't have the number, but it's the 2nd or 3rd page of chapter 7. And that's where we'll start. What we'll do is we'll look at 3 different sets of questions today as we have our conversation. On page 152, you can see that chapter 7 is built around the research of Linda Hill at Harvard. And we use her research just as kind of an organizing theme for that chapter. But what she studied is a bunch of innovative organizations and asks what kind of things what kind of organizational characteristics should we try to promote? And she lists 5 organizational characteristics. And I'm going to go through those very quickly just to remind us, and then probably just say a couple of sentences about each on how they apply to seminaries and congregations. The first is an identity creating purpose. This is actually the hardest one for seminaries and churches because you have to have a purpose that demands innovation. Most seminaries and most churches think we already have a purpose, and innovating would be pleasant and nice, and we'd all be glad that it happened, but it's not absolutely positively necessary. Chapter 9 will argue that it's absolutely positively necessary for seminaries. But most seminaries do not see innovating into the future as part of their identity. And to the extent that they don't, they will not give it enough time. And so we can have a conversation about what would it look like for both a congregation or a seminary to come to discover that their purpose demands, their very identity demands that they must innovate. The second is the idea of communally shared values. It's not just, we all agree values are important, but these are values that head towards innovation. These are the values that support innovation. And they are embedded in, for example, number 3, the idea of diversity-rich collaboration. The idea that we must collaborate together, but we must collaborate together by having many, many, many voices that are usually not from the same perspective. One of the ways that our congregations and our seminaries have in the past ensured collaboration is by excluding all the voices that don't agree with those in power. And so that is a great way to ensure collaboration and consensus, and also a great way to destroy any ability to innovate, because everyone is so committed to the present and to the status quo and to their own power that they lose sight of the purpose of why we're here. Experiment-driven learning, that's one that we in our churches are particularly bad at. One of the things that when I work, this project here that I do with you is one of 3 innovative projects we do at Fuller. One's on the youth ministry innovation, one's on ministry innovation with young adults, and then this one's innovation for vocation. When we were working with the youth ministry one of the things that we found is that congregations have a tendency to do the opposite of experimenting. They decide on something in advance, and then they decide to, when they do something new, they have a logo and theme music and they announce it all. And then they say, come watch us make our rookie mistakes in public. And what happens is they make rookie mistakes and someone says, well, I guess that idea didn't work. And then they never move on. We need to be able to try a bunch of experiments, much like a restaurant. I don't know if you've ever worked at a restaurant that was just opening, but they do what they call a soft opening. They're open for a couple, 3 months while they get all the kinks out, and then they have the grand opening. We invite people to watch us make our rookie mistakes and then penalize us for it. And then the last thing is integrative decision making. And what I love here is Pixar's notion of that's related to values, in that they value candor. They say, if I know you're making a mistake and I don't tell you, that's not respectful, that's mean. So those are the 5. Let me check with you and see how is my video doing okay? I've had no problem with video for 6 months. And then this morning, my video started doing some funny things. And so I just wanted to make sure if there's a problem, you let me know. And so Maureen's okay. So if Maureen's okay, I guess we're all okay. So that's good. So let's, we've got 5 of these characteristics, and if you can build those 5 into your culture, you can promote innovation. Would any of you like to take up particular questions about any of these 5? Or if not, I will ask some more specific questions. We can say hello to Laura. Laura, you can catch up pretty easily simply by turning to page 152. We're talking about the 5 characteristics of innovative culture that are mentioned on that page and that are in chapter 7. So page 152, you and your snowman. Would anyone like to take up any of those 5 questions and think about how they relate to seminaries or churches? Or should I ask a more specific question?
I think the very first one, I think they're all very important points. I also lead, I'm the dean of our local school for formation, theological formation, and we use these principles, all of them, in order to work. And there's great resistance. So I would add another one. I don't know where it would be, like some permission giving. People actually do have the ability to be innovative, to be given a little bit of a, oh, I might, you make me nervous, but I've got your back. That would be a nice one to, I don't know where they would fit, but
Well, a lot
I
of that
find
comes
that,
under, I'm sorry, keep going. I thought you cut out and I thought you were done. Keep going.
no, a lot of that comes under what?
A lot of that comes
comes
under the
under what?
experiment-driven learning, because one of the assumptions of experiment-driven learning is your first experiment will not be the last experiment. My daughter is an experimental physicist, and
Exactly.
every step they take is a step in the right direction, but no one experiment is going to solve everything. And the other day she did something and it crashed and burned, but that was actually learning. Her group celebrated it, but if we were in the church, we would all say, "Oh, see, now we just got to stop that." So you're absolutely right that we need a
I know
value
from my,
of permission giving that says that's how learning takes place. Go ahead, Maureen.
I just personally have found that when I like, where your goals, etc. A lot of times people try to tamp them down, say, "Ooh, I don't know." They really don't even understand that it's okay. I'm fine with failure. I mean, I'm not going to try something I think will totally fail, but I am fine if I don't get the final result the first time, because I do view that as a positive step forward. But the culture does penalize it, and the culture doesn't understand. And most of my colleagues will only come up with something, announce something that's almost can't fail, but it does anyway. And they don't know why it failed, because they kept it all bottled up until it was perfect.
So
And,
one of the things that we do,
I don't know. I
especially
just
with
really liked.
go ahead.
No, I was done.
Okay, yeah. One of the things we do, especially with our youth ministry and young adult ministry groups, is talk a lot about how important it is to plan for how you're going to do your experiments on the margins. Don't do your experiments in the mainstream. And so literally when we're doing coaching, people will talk about an experiment and we will ask, is that experiment too mainstream? Are too many eyes watching that experiment? Because you need to have, you need to be able to learn without penalty. And so we strategize with people about how to learn without being penalized for any mistakes that you make. And it took a lot of permission giving on our part, because we're funding projects. They want to say, no, it's got to be a big giant thing. And we say, no, it's not yet ready to be a big giant thing. It needs to be a small series of learnings that you can eventually bring together. And then we use this soft opening kind of example a lot. And that helps people kind of see, oh, okay, we're going to get all the recipes right. We're going to get all the kinks in the kitchen out. We're going to get all the serving right. And then we'll take it into prime time. And we regularly have to coach them that that's okay and welcome, because they think because they're receiving money, we want them to do it in the mainstream too quickly. Any other comments on that? Oh, good, Jane.
I was just going to say, I think the other thing that happens both in churches and in seminaries is I think sometimes people will be willing to try a small experiment, but then they don't think after that one, okay, what did we learn? What's the next one? Like there's no going in a direction with a series of learnings. It's just like one-off little things.
I keep thinking about one of the tenets of field education. If you were to work with the Association of Theological Field Educators, one of the tenets that they would regularly talk about is a quote from John Dewey that says, people don't learn from experience. They learn from reflection on experience. And we need to build reflections on experience into our regular learning. Otherwise, we don't actually learn something, we just move on.
I think too, part of the giving permission is not just reflecting on the experience, but also celebrating that process. Like on 164, you have a list of ways that you can help people start experimenting. And I like the one that says celebrate the team that fails, because I think I worked at a private Christian high school for a few years. And what they celebrated was years of service and the people who burned themselves out doing their job. They would cheer and celebrate for them. And that reinforces a particular way of doing things. And I think if we only celebrate successes, we also unintentionally minimize the necessary failures that experiment.
That's a great point. One of the things that I talked about in the book, but I wished I'd emphasized more, I realized that if I could get my own seminary to do just this one thing, I think we would have innovation, a lot more innovation. It was this idea of what they jokingly call in Silicon Valley Boyle's Law. There's a guy named Boyle who came up with this plan, and there's a physics idea called Boyle's Law, but now they call this, and the idea of Boyle's Law is this: never come to a meeting without a prototype. And what they mean by that is that if, how many meetings have I been in today? 3? Yeah, I had 2 hours of class and 3 hours of meetings before we met. Doesn't that sound like fun? And for each of the meetings, I got an agenda in advance. And most of the agenda was, yeah. Oh, and then there was something that I thought, okay, this is a problem we're going to have to solve. Boyle's Law would say, don't come to the meeting with just, okay, I want to bring up this question. You would instead say, here are the parameters, I think, for what we need to do to solve it. And here's at least 3 different ideas for how we might go about solving it. And if we can get people to regularly think using those kinds of phrasings, you just get more ideas per square inch into your meetings. In my seminary context, I cannot get my colleagues to do that because it would require them to read their agendas in advance and to actually think about them. And they would argue that I'm just too busy to put that kind of time into the work. I can come to the meeting, but that's about the best you can ask from me. And maybe that's just my version of faculty members. But I would argue that many church boards are the same way. Anything else before I move on to the next chapter to discuss?
Scott, I know that I've heard a lot of work on kind of ritual and the power of ritual, even obviously in the church, but also kind of in business context and behavioral change context. I was wondering if and even in the annual meeting 2 years ago, I remember somebody mentioned a ritual, almost a funeral for an idea that it was kind of for getting congregations to change, but sort of having a mock funeral. I don't know how it was done. I mean, it sounds like it could come across as pretty patronizing, so you'd have to think about that. But have you thought of maybe rituals like that or others that could kind of embed some of these processes in congregations or in hubs or other organizations pursuing this work?
I have like 3 different answers to this. my first answer is, as an innovation scholar and a Christian, I would point you back to the chapter on practices. I think a lot of the Christian practices actually provide us a way of doing just that. So I could go into detail on that if you want, but that's one answer. As an organizational scholar, one of the things that I'll tell you is that it's important to give people an opportunity to, well, one of the things that you do is you plant language and you anticipate in advance what are the kinds of questions that are going to come up. Questions that come up are, we've never done it that way before, or we tried that and it failed, or, but what about Mary who's going to complain? Or those kinds of, those are not rituals, but those are ritualized statements. And that if you can come up in advance and plant language in response to those, then you have subverted the rituals that will tamp down innovation. But those are not formal rituals. The formal rituals often become important for measuring milestones. One of the things we don't do enough of is measuring milestones. The beginning of a project, the middle when we first accomplished our first even experiment that may have crashed and burned. Those kinds of, measuring those milestones and celebrating them no matter what gives you an opportunity to interpret them. So creating the standard milestones and then interpreting those. We do that a lot with some of our youth ministry stuff when we talk about how important it is to use Heifetz's terms, maintain disciplined attention. And when we maintain disciplined attention, we have to have different kind of milestones that people meet so that they can regularly be re-engaged, I guess is the term. Anything else before I go on to chapter 9? I want to talk a lot about chapter 9 because it's so germane to what the work that many of us do. Laura says, I think that the ritual of a funeral is in Mike Mather's book. Well, there we go. Thank you. I want to point you to chapter 9. For those of you who have the book, chapter 9 begins on page 203. And I want to point to 3 concepts and see, these concepts are about how do we train seminarians, but I really think it's about what do we need to cultivate in leaders, whether it is church leaders or church leaders who are ordained, non-ordained, any of them. And so here's what the first concept is, the idea of theological camels. This comes from a Lilly report about 20 years ago, where they described the basic methodology that we use in seminary is this. We treat everybody like a camel. We pump them with enough knowledge to last a lifetime, and then we send them off into the desert and hope they make it to the next oasis. And I want to contrast that with the idea of agility, because camels are constructed for a very predictable world. And I would argue that most of our church leaders, whether they are pastors or congregational leaders, are calibrated for a predictable world. I mean, a camel's a great idea if you are trying to do something very specific in moving from one oasis to the next in a known area of a desert. But we don't know what's over the next sand dune. It could be a barrio, it could be a shopping mall, it could be an ocean. We just don't know, he said in the midst of COVID, which none of us saw coming. And so because of that, we have to educate for agility. And I don't know that we have done a good enough job educating for agility. And so I can have some conversation with you about that. But it seems to me that anyone who wants to promote innovation in a congregation is going to have to take up the question of agility. What do you think of this idea of agility and how it contrasts with the idea of camels? Does that do anything for you?
mean, that's some imagery. I went to Camel. Our mascot was the camel at Campbell University. But I think most of us think of the church as the last place that's agile, where you're going to find any agility, because it's so known for being the slowest institution to change, just about in most contexts.
And this is why innovation matters, is because our very credibility is built on continuity with the past. But at the same time, we have to invent our new way of presenting that past to the future. Jane, one of the Janes, you're next to each other on my screen, and I saw a flicker of a hand. I don't know which one it was.
Say that too. I was just going to say, I struggle with this with my students because for a couple of reasons, agility is frightening to them. One is just that they're beginners. So they're just trying to get the basics of things. If you start to tell them, no, it's going to be really complex and kind of open-ended when you get out of here, they're like, ah! And the other is a lot of the reason that they feel loved and they want to be like that person. I guess, you know, if I had enough time to spend with each one, like I could maybe tease out how that person was actually agile and kind of help them get there. But a lot of them have fallen in love with the church as it is. And they really feel disheartened if you talk about the fact that that church isn't going to be here for much of their ministry. It's really going to be different. So I struggle with that. Both of those.
I'll wave my hand. It's a fascinating idea, agility. It seems like it's a word that's popping up more and more. A former church member and friend of mine was the chief technology officer for a major Fortune 500 computer-aided design software company. And agility, being agile, is a buzzword in the software development community. And the fascinating thing about it is some of the code that was written 10, 20 years ago for a particular piece of software is still a part of the software today. But the language of we've got to be agile and constantly building and developing this software. And the thing that causes me to scratch my head about the church, of all places that one might think would need to be agile, it would be a community of faith. If this idea of being flexible and agile and adapting and learning to shift our footing is out there in the corporate world in a significant way, why isn't it in the church? I'm scratching my head over that. And if y'all have an answer to that, it would be very helpful.
I will give you an answer in a moment, but I think Maureen has a hand up and Bazan has a hand up. And so I'm going to let them go first, and then I'll come back to you.
Just going to share that in our communities of calling hub, I think we've seen agility correlate with size of the congregation. It tends that the smaller congregations have an easier time adapting because they don't have quite as many structures of councils and leadership and things in place in order to get something to happen. So one of our more successful churches is the small rural church of about 250 people, and they can really make changes and they're a lot more agile, I think, just because their size. But then I think even more importantly for this, we've seen agility correlate with discernment practices, and the congregations that spent the time during this initiative the first couple of years really doing the formation work around discernment practices with their congregations are now able to adapt, like during this pandemic time, much more easily than those where this was just kind of a pet project for some folks. And the congregation overall doesn't have as much experience with doing discernment, since I think one of the most important facets of discernment is that ability to be agile and respond and listen to what's going on in the moment.
So I want to connect up Jesse and Michael, if that's okay. I think that this is why leadership begins with listening. A significant part of the discernment process is this listening. And if you do a great deal of listening to the people entrusted to your care, and you feel that empathy for them, it becomes much more difficult to put your own interests first and to try to preserve what you have, because you can see the reason to change right in front of you. But if you don't do that listening, it's very easy to project your own experience onto everybody else. And the catalyst to agility is listening. Maureen, did you want to say something?
Well, first of all, I do agree with Jesse about the smaller congregations being much more adept at that. And I would say I came, maybe my problem was I was not churched until I went early 40s. And I came into a situation, and I had worked on decision-making and change before. That's what I had done before in my life. And I came to church, and people, I had this sense of urgency that it's really important. We need to let people know about this church thing. It's really cool. And people were like, always wanted to tamp down enthusiasm. But not only that, I was like basing it off of Jesus. I'm thinking of, if you look at the early church, there was no sense of, let's just see what we should do. They were bold people. They took risk. They tried different things. Sometimes they messed up. And so, yes, history does, and especially the Episcopal Church, where we love to have things like they were 500 years ago. There is that impetus. But on the other hand, if we can inspire people about that, we come from a group of innovators. Yes, there was a 1800-year period where we weren't very innovative, but let's get rid of that part and just think of where we need to be. And I would commend Andy Doyle, who's a bishop of the Diocese of Texas. He is saying exactly a lot of things you're saying, Scott. And if you haven't read any of his works, he's written quite a lot of books about the need for being adaptive and nimble.
So I want to ask, what kind of learning activities can we do with congregations or with leaders in order to get them to become more comfortable being agile? And what I'm really interested in is in chapter 9, it talks about the Kelly brothers, who are the much of the work on innovation that you've ever heard of. Does anything about design goes back to the Kelly brothers. They would argue that there are what they call 4 phobias that prevent people from taking a step into the unknown. The fear of the messy unknown, the fear of being judged, the fear of the first step, and the fear of losing control. And I tried some of that, and I found that to be so helpful. I went back and I rewrote the class that I teach, the introductory class. So if you're an MDiv student and there's an introductory class that you take in your very first quarter, and I teach that, I went back and rebuilt that class around the 4 phobias. And I had them read this from the beginning, and I told them that we're going to encounter in the course each of these phobias, and that they're going to work in teams on dealing with it. And my students responded in 2 ways. Number 1 is they absolutely hated the idea. And number 2 is they were very grateful for the idea. They understood they did not want to do this, and they understood they needed to do this, and they understood it needed to be in community and that it could not be individual. And the way I do evaluation in my courses is I let them vote on a number of the pedagogical choices that I make and say, okay, here are the choices that I made. You don't get to change your class, it's over now, but you get to vote, and in the future, I will change based on whatever it is you vote. And one of the things that they had a choice of doing was whether or not I should have students work in this way on the 4 phobias. And they found that to be particularly helpful and something that I should continue. And so it seems to me that if we can get congregational leaders to name these phobias, to live with them in community, then it becomes part of the language that we plant that allows them to find a way to say yes when all their fears say they should say no. What do you think about these 4 phobias? Do they resonate for you? Is that something that you've seen in congregations or in your students? What would you like to say about these 4 phobias?
I recognize him personally, but also I was thinking, I'm teaching Intro to New Testament with my students. We're on the Gospel of Mark, and the disciples don't do everything right there. And I was thinking about how helpful this might be as a frame from them, because we were just talking about that. And it might be really interesting to use this and look at what the disciples do, and right in front of you. They do a lot of failing. It's really interesting, and maybe there's some wisdom there.
One of my colleagues at Fuller is a man named Steve Argue. He's probably the nation's leading authority on the spiritual life of young adults, especially people who are what we would call emerging adults. And he would argue that these 4 phobias are particularly true of young adults today. That the way that the educational system and the way that parenting has taken place in the last 20 years makes it so students are much more likely to want very circumscribed and clear problems to solve with very clear parameters, preferably rubrics, and some kind of they don't want to be judged. They don't want to think they're going to be judged without being able to control how the outcome is going to be. And I tell my students from the beginning, I'm putting you in positions where I'm purposely not giving you detailed rubric-driven parameters, but I'm giving you large goals and letting you figure it out together, because you're going to have to face this in life in ministry. And regularly I get back from them, that's not fair. And then we talk about it. Yep, you're absolutely right. It is not fair. It is true to life, and life is not fair in exactly this way. And that's why I'm giving you community to work on it together. And I ask them at the end of the quarter, should I continue doing this? And the answer is yes. But I would think that if we can, I can tell you about some of the exercises I use, but I would think that the congregations that we work with might find these 4 phobias something that they can name and face together.
Yeah, I think that the idea of facing it together is really key. We've tried to be really intentional about offering opportunities for peer learning and chances to come together with other congregational leaders to say, hey, what's working with your initiative and what's not working, and what are you learning from what's not working, and asking that specifically and intentionally has helped in some ways to normalize a reflection that's not just here's all the great things that we're doing, but also here's what we're learning from what's not working. And so we've been intentional in our mid-year evaluation and things over the last year or two to ask very clearly what's not working and what are you learning, and then bringing that into the larger group conversation.
Thanks.
I think
For our
it's
10 minutes together, what I'd like to do is look at the big picture. We've had 3 weeks together, and we started out with the first line was, the church as we know it is calibrated for a world that no longer exists. And then I introduced you to a good Episcopalian named Erica, who worked with middle school students and was trying to do innovation with them by listening to their lives and realizing what they needed to know most was lament. And working with lament, that's where we did the Mad Libs. And what I want to do is emphasize the role of story. Story works in a bunch of different ways. My students, our congregations, the people you work with, the pastors you work, they need stories, but they need stories of very different kinds. They need stories that, on the one hand, are stories of hope, stories of this is success. But they also need stories that legitimate failure. That say, okay, we tried this, it crashed and burned, and that was what we learned on the way to something good. They also need stories of people who are not like them, so that they can find ways to season whatever it is that they're doing with a spice that might look a little different than the ones that they use. Talk to me a little bit about how stories have played a part in your particular innovative processes and the ways in which you have used stories by inviting people into story.
One example I have.
Let's go Jane, Angwa, and then Michael.
I am coaching some parishes, some churches with Vibrant Faith. And one of the things that we asked them to do, usually when it was like our very first meetings, they're working toward becoming thriving parishes, not just surviving. So they were to introduce themselves to each other with story. And fascinatingly enough, some of them would go around the room and they were just like, hey, I'm Joe Smith and I work at NASA and I do this and this and this. That was okay, it was fine. But the ones that spoke about were their first encounter with Jesus, like that was the way that they started and went around the room talking about that, their first experience. They have moved faster, farther, greater than the other churches that I'm coaching because of that. And I think it's that level of vulnerability that they immediately wanted to do that. They want to become that thriving church. So they're so, looking forward to that goal that they'll do anything to get there. And if it means being vulnerable, saying stupid things in front of people, they're going to do it because they want that end product, that they're going to help create.
And what it has to do is the story they told included Jesus. NASA guy told a story, but it didn't really include Jesus. And so one of the first things you're going to have to do is help them loop Jesus back into their story. Anybody who's telling a story that includes Jesus is going to go faster than if someone who's telling a story that, oh yeah, I guess I should include Jesus. Michael, what were you going to say?
We worked with a church, did a listening session with them. They were doing some visioning, thinking about the future. And the only stories that they told were stories of how it used to be. And it was so very difficult to nudge them to think about, where are things now? And they shifted into, we've got to do something about the decline of our church. And that's as you brought out about a technical problem, that was their orientation. They were not able to wrap their minds around, it didn't seem to me, the idea of being agile, thinking about an adaptive challenge and what do we do. But the stories were all about the good old days. And
one of the leaders that I really respect that was in one of our churches said, innovating in order to save a dying church is a really crummy reason, although he didn't say crummy. What he talked about instead was the reason to innovate is that there are people who need to hear the gospel message. There are people that God is calling to, and that their lives would be better. And to the extent that if we ever have a congregation that is focused on, we need to innovate in order to make the congregation better. That's why we really do a lot of pushing on leadership begins with listening and sending them back to listen to the people that are entrusted to their care, because God doesn't need you to save God's church. God will take care of God's church. God calls you instead to introduce the gospel to the people who need to hear, because the gospel is God's response to the human condition. And you need to be listening to the human condition if you're going to be able to respond to that. And that was news to a lot of our churches. I can think of one pocket of churches particularly that getting them past the institutional reason for innovating took a while. Jesse,
Is there time for me to add something, or are we
go,
on a short time?
please, yes.
Okay, so one of the pieces of work I'm doing is on emotional resilience and adaptive change. And one of the things I've learned along the way is that we can't listen well to other people's emotions in areas where we are not able to handle that level of emotion ourselves. So I have to distance myself from other people's fear, anxiety, loss, despair, if I can't feel those things and let them be present to me. So part of, I think, our work as leaders is to grow our own ability to feel those things and not have to hold them off. And that takes a lot of internal work, but I think it also means that our faith has a significant place to play in this, in the sense of like, who is God as a secure place in all of this? And it comes back to the theological question. So I think, yeah.
I love the idea that God is at work in us. And if God is not at work in us, helping us face our fears, we will not be able to face anyone else's fears. Janae, did you start to say something?
I did. Hello, everyone. Yeah, it reminds me of testimony in the African American church, that there is a period when you come together and then you give the testimony. That is the story, and it's a way of connecting. Of I'm sorry, I'm getting a call in the midst of this. It is a way of connecting, building community, encouraging, and Jesus is in the midst of that testimony, because ultimately it really is about how I made it over, and particularly as a people who had to make it over and transcend a lot of efforts to dehumanize who we were. That testimony validated and affirmed that we too are children of God. So yeah, very important.
Amen. Amen. So let me ask this at the end. Many of you have now read this book. You think, what's missing? What do you wish was here? Well, okay. I'm not hearing anybody respond to that.
That just means it's perfect.
Yeah, I really doubt that. I really doubt that.
I know. You know I'm joking.
I would offer, as I was reading this and thinking about it, Scott, how nice it would be to have a study guide or some type of way that it could be more easily adaptable and useful in a congregational leadership setting.
So one of the things that I have started on actually is to create such a thing. If I created a short version of this, what would be the ideal number of pages? I was thinking if I could get a 25-page version of this book, would that be a good thing? Is 25 right? Is 12 right? Is 30 right? You know, what are you thinking?
I think this is an academic attempt to do something that people who like academics will really resonate with. But I think the target audience is not necessarily academic, and they need to have things a little bit more parsed out and keep the major themes. And I would say, especially the last few chapters, where it was much more it was more helpful. I mean, the first time you're explaining the problem, and I think that's important that people see that. But they're going to want to get to the end parts. So I think 25 pages is a little short. I mean, I think you could do a little over, with big font and everything. I think 120 pages would be fine with a study guide. If you want it to be used in congregations and in vestries, governing councils, if that's one of your aims. As it is now, this is good for individuals, but I don't know many I don't know many book groups that would be able to read this much with all the things that we're doing right now.
Fair
I mean,
enough.
that's just honest, for myself.
That's why I asked the question. Okay, so
I think a 25-page primer, sorry, Jane, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Would be great and helpful for people who are like us, who are working with congregations that just need some quick reference and things like that. I think a little bit longer for folks but this felt practical to me in ways I haven't read a lot lately that really gives, like, you know, changing mental models and the case studies and the examples. It did feel like it has a lot of practical application to me. And I appreciated all of your take on Christian leadership, because I think the biggest mental model for a lot of church people and attenders is the way they view their pastors and their staff. And having served on a church staff, as you know, just 4 years ago, I left a church staff, but I see in very real time and hear from people who I think they have the wrong mental model about church leadership, and our church's pastor is, you know, to shepherd to the next faithful step, but they treat pastors more like the secular kind of leadership, like they should have a plan, they should have a vision, and we attach failure when pastors don't lead in that concrete way that people have wrapped their minds around. So I almost wonder if there's like a church elder, deacon, lay leader portion of this, and then a pastor portion. Does that make sense?
I'm writing that down. Jane, you want to say something?
I was thinking in terms of, things that would be good. You know, I picture my own congregational arrangement where, you know, the lay board meets every month. And so, and they will do a book over several months. So one thing I noticed is, like, you're such a dynamic speaker, and I wondered about like a series of 4 short videos that could be played at the beginning of a meeting and then people could talk about it or something. I don't know if you have the bandwidth for that, but I think it would be amazingly useful, really dynamic. And if it went along with this other short written resource, that would be fantastic.
So I took my whole class and turned it into 184 7-minute videos. So I'm very used to doing 7-minute videos at this point. And so I could turn this book into 7-minute videos that we could place online. So that's something I could very much consider doing.
Oh.
So, okay.
I think the future is 7-minute videos.
Well, let me say thank you to all. As an author, I am grateful when people read my work and take it seriously. So just all I can do at this point is say thank you. May I close us with a blessing? God, thank you. Thank you for what you've done in this group and through this group and for this group. Bless the congregations that are entrusted to their care so that those congregations may serve the people that all belong to you. In your name. Amen. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Scott.
Amen.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Really good
Thank
to
you.
see you all.
Here. Bye.